pleasure to introduce Juan Pablo Ardila, because over the course of the last year and a half, I feel like I've come to know you much more than I had known any PhD candidates in the history department before, through the work that we are doing together for the Melon Dispossessions in the Americas grant, and I really have learned a lot from you in the last year and a half. So for me, it's really a pleasure now to be able to listen to you present your work and very soon read it as well. I'm sorry that I'm behind on that. So Juan Pablo Ardila is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. His dissertation examines the ways in which emotions such as fear, confession, guilt, and hope gave meaning to people's sense of reality, their memories, and their imagined futures in the territories of the former Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada or New Granada. He focuses on the period between 1808, when the Spanish monarchical crisis broke out, and 1830, when the First Republic of Colombia dissolved. His research explores the role of emotions shaping political debates and both facilitating and hindering reforms. By doing so, he looks at the inner workings of emotions. He delves into questions concerning how emotions come about, how emotional experiences vary across society, and how individuals and social groups use emotional expressions strategically. To do all of this in the historical context adds a layer of complexity that I can only imagine, and I'm very much looking forward to hear more about. He holds a BA in economics and a BA in history from the University de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, and an MA in history from also University de los Andes, and another MA in history, of course, as part of his PhD degree or studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. So, Pablo, it's a pleasure to have you here. Juan Pablo, thank you so much for presenting your work.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone for being here. Kathy, if you want, I can speak it from here.
Yes, you can see here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But to pass the slides, I think I need the computer or from here.
I can go from here, yes.
Okay.
Would you like, and then just go, here we go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. You're
Thank you,
the host
Kathy.
of here.
Thank you, everyone. On the morning of December 2, 1821, Bogotá's residents gathered in the city's main square to acclaim the recently enacted Cúcuta Constitution. At around 9 a.m., Bogotá's councilmen marched into the main square and walked towards the throne resting on a platform placed in the middle of the square. Those leading the procession carried a standard of Bogotá with the Constitution hanging from its rod. When they reached the platform, two of them carefully set the standard and the Constitution on the throne. They then picked up the Constitution and began reading it out loud. When they finished reading the text, the crowd cheered, "Long live the sacred Constitution of the Republic of Colombia," and made promises to uphold, obey, and respect the Constitution and the Republic's magistrates and officials. Amidst the cheers, some yelled that they would defend the Constitution with their own interests, with their blood, and with their own lives. Once the praises and acclamations came to an end, one of the councilmen grabbed the standard with the Constitution affixed to it and walked back to the city hall. He then mounted a horse and began his way towards the city's main streets while displaying the standard and the Constitution. All the other councilmen, as well as Bogotá's top civil and military authorities and several city notables, followed his lead. According to the scribe's account, onlookers cheered and expressed their happiness as they saw the Constitution and the procession pass by. The scribe explained that the Indians standing on the sides of the streets were particularly satisfied as they saw their holy desires fulfilled with the Republic's reestablishment, along with the publication of the Constitution that would govern them. I'm gonna take this off. I also had COVID not so long ago, so This is a painting from the mid-19th century, but you can imagine this is the main square of Bogotá. You can imagine a throne in the middle of the square and a constitution being put on the throne. Even though Bogotá's residents were celebrating a republican constitution, the festivity was grounded on old regime notions of symbolic power. During the celebration, the throne placed in the city's square stood out as the most visible symbol of power. In Bogotá, in 1821, a throne entailed authority and legitimacy for a variety of reasons. It represented the seat from which monarchs imparted commands and enforced their authority. Yet it also denoted religious authority. Catholics believed there was only one throne in heaven and that that throne belonged to God. Moreover, kings and queens who sat in the throne were usually regarded as blessed and consecrated beings. In this case, however, the throne was not meant for a monarch or for God, but for a constitution. Similar to the meanings it brought about in monarchical regimes, the throne sought to bestow the constitution with a certain sense of legitimacy, authority, and sacredness. Those who attended the public ceremony referred to the charter as the sacred constitution of the Republic of Colombia. The scribe even explained that the Indians viewing the procession and praising the constitution held a holy desire to see its publication. In that sense, the ceremony did not represent a disruption in old regime conceptions of symbolic power, despite the act of replacing a monarch with a republican charter. Similarly, the celebration built on colonial social hierarchies and relations of power. During the rite, direct contact and access to the constitution was unequal. The constitution was carried, displayed, and read aloud by the city's councilmen. Those who were closest to the charter, both when it was read and when it was displayed during the procession, were top authorities and city notables. Plebeians and Indians were expected to see the constitution from a distance and to hear its content through the mediation of Bogotá's patricians. Their part in the festivity was a somewhat passive and ornamental one. They cheered and celebrated the charter as Bogotá's patricians presented it to them. The celebration of the 1821 Constitution is but an example of the persistence of monarchical and colonial archetypes after the onset of republicanism. People's notions of power and how they were supposed to be represented were shaped by models and mental images of monarchical symbols and colonial social relations. The political changes that were taking place in the 1820s did not bring about immediate transformations in society's conditions of symbolic power, nor in people's notions of social organization. Such conceptions cannot be easily erased or altered in people's minds. At the time, the new republic citizens and officials were still coming to terms with what independence and republicanism meant and how power and social order were to be understood and represented under these new political circumstances. Models and mental images from the old regime shaped not only rituals, such as the celebrations of the 1821 Constitution, but also the debates and emotions of the time. In the 1820s, the inhabitants of the newly formed republic strategically looked back to monarchical representations of power, to colonial social hierarchies, and to past events to give meaning to the world they were living in. Archetypes from the colonial period informed discussions and guided people's emotions. A mental image of prior symbols of power or of bygone notions of society brought about emotions and emotional expressions associated to those particular archetypes. For instance, patricians, slave owners, and even middle sectors alluded to an ideal and bygone social order to justify their dread to slave manumission and to any reform leading to racial equality. At times, debates over the republic's political stability ended up in insinuations in favor of powerful absolutist leaders. Some did not doubt in suggesting that stability could only be achieved by returning to a monarchical form of government. They waived the threat of anarchy, similar to what monarchists had done some years earlier, to justify absolutist projects. In the end, all these allusions to ideal models of society and to past notions of political stability shaped the sorts of emotions that came about and the ways in which such feelings were understood, experienced, and expressed. The paper I'm presenting today is part of the epilogue, or maybe the fifth chapter, depends on what my committee says, of my dissertation. Throughout the dissertation, I pose a series of historiographical reflections regarding the period that traditionally has been known as the independence process. I highlight the uncertainty and confusion that most people in North and South America experienced between 1808, when the monarchical crisis broke out in the Iberian Peninsula, to 1830, when the First Republic of Colombia began to be dissolved with the separation of Venezuela and Ecuador. In the dissertation, I argued that the advent of independence and republicanism was not an inevitable end, nor was it something desired by all. Throughout the text, I try to push back against the notion that independence and republicanism brought about a significant break in people's lives. Likewise, my dissertation poses a series of reflections regarding the ways in which emotions come about and how they are experienced and understood. I pay close attention to the ways in which emotions travel and arise through rumors, recollections, and particular events. I suggest that emotions can shape people's understanding of the world they live in, and that emotions can disrupt society's hegemonic frameworks. I indicate that emotions are shaped by society's collective memory at the same time that emotions shape people's notions of the past. I also claim that emotional experiences vary across society. Gender, class, racial, political, and religious divisions, among others, affect the ways emotions are experienced and understood. Additionally, I suggest that emotional expressions and manifestations shape the meanings given to people's actions and conduct. In that sense, expressing emotions in certain ways can become a form of strategy to convey certain messages. Another intimation I make is that emotions are not separated from rationality, but are constitutive of rational thought. That is, emotions do not blur or distort rationality. On the contrary, they inform and guide a person's thought process and shape the ways in which ensuing actions and conducts come about. But let us go back to 1821 with the ritual in which a constitution was placed on a throne. As I explained, all regime archetypes were at play. These monarchical and colonial models, for their part, shaped people's emotions. William Reddy's notion of emotives helped us understand how the act of labeling a feeling, or in the case being made in this epilogue, the act of opting for a particular reference or model, ends up guiding and shaping emotions. For Reddy, emotives are utterances or speech acts through which individuals define and characterize emotions. When a person is feeling a series of sensations, emotives come into play in the moment in which an individual decides to identify those feelings and label them under a particular category or term. In that sense, an emotive is the act in which a person names an emotion in accordance with society's terminology and understanding of what such emotion implies. In that sense, Reddy claims that emotives can be considered as utterances aimed at briefly characterizing the current state of activated thought material that exceeds the current capacity of attention. One of the main implications that comes with Reddy's definition is that the act of naming and labeling a feeling realigns an individual's emotions. When a person experiences a feeling and labels such sensation under a particular term, that person's feelings are readjusted to fit that term. For instance, when the assistants to the acclamation of the 1821 Constitution began to acclaim the Charter, it is possible that some identified and labeled what they were feeling as happiness and joyfulness. According to Reddy, this act of labeling would have brought about a realignment in their emotional experience and expressions in order to match the meanings and implications that happiness had in such context. The archetypes and models that pop up into people's minds shape emotions in an analogous way to Reddy's emotives. When an individual labels a particular situation with a mental image or model, such as shared remembrance or a prevailing notion of social order, that action ends up guiding emotions and shaping the ways in which they are experienced and expressed. In 1821 in Bogotá, the throne brought up mental images associated to the reverence and awe that kings and queens produced. These archetypes steered people's emotions into feeling some sort of happiness and joy at the sight of the Cúcuta Constitution resting on the throne. As people struggled to understand and give meaning to the worlds they were living in, the archetypes that came up in their minds ended up managing and directing their emotions and forms of expression. In the 1820s, archetypes and models of stability, order, and security hailing from the colonial and monarchical past continually popped up into people's minds. In Bogotá and other parts of northern South America, feelings of uncertainty and security had become prevalent among many of the region's residents. Despite the hopes and dreams that came about with the advent of the new Republican nations, years of violence and unrest had left many feeling doubtful and hesitant of the future ahead of them. Independence and the adoption of a Republican form of government furthered these people's misgivings. For many of them, symbols such as the throne, painting, were a school's reputation not only inspired authority and sacredness, but also a sense of certainty and security amidst the turmoil they were living. Aspirations for social and political stability became recurrent amongst people of different social stratum and political inclinations. They actively sought references of what order and security were supposed to look like in times in which Colombian society debated central issues such as the expropriation of church properties, racial equality, slave manumission, and the government system the country should adopt. For instance, in the town of Villalba, about 150 kilometers northeast of Bogotá, the persistence of archetypes from the colonial past gave shape to religious and political tensions and people's ensuing emotions. In 1828, Villalba's residents and those of neighboring villages rioted against national officials over a sacred painting. During the first years of Republican life, the new government sought to establish new schools and universities. Funding for these institutions partly came from the expropriation of properties belonging to the Catholic Church, including religious objects and images. One of such objects was the painting of the Exe Homo. Just to make sure, I'm not talking about this Exe Homo painting that made so many headlines some years ago and still comes up in so many memes. I'm talking about this painting on the left. This painting was taken by Spanish troops during the 1827 sack of Rome and brought to the Americas in the early 17th century as a contribution for the foundation of a Dominican convent in the vicinities of Villalba. In 1825, as Republican officials sought funds to finance the newly established Universidad of Boyacá, a rumor spread throughout the region claiming that the university was going to sell the Exe Homo painting. Residents in Villalba and nearby villages protested against such prospect. They ended up assaulting the convent, seizing the painting, and hiding it in Villalba. Local authorities explained that the situation became so tense that they feared an outbreak of violence throughout the region. On the right are the two pictures of the convent. So you can imagine people storming the convent and taking the painting and taking it to town and hiding it in a house. In April and May of 1825, Villalba's officials, the intendant of Boyacá and the president of the University of Boyacá, exchanged a series of letters seeking a solution to this problem. Despite some frictions among them, they all agreed that it would be unwise to sell the painting or to remove it from the region. Throughout their dispatches, officials echoed local residents' feelings and thoughts about the issue. They explained that many of the region's inhabitants believed the painting and convent gave them protection, status, and well-being. Locals referred to the convent as a place of pilgrimage, and to the painting as a sacred object. For many, losing the painting meant they would be deprived of a sacred tradition. The intendant claimed that people from the region were accustomed to worship God in such adorned temples, and it would be very painful for them to see their temples naked and ruined. The university's president, Bernardo Maria La Mota, argued that the institution administrators would not want to see local residents deprived of an ornament to which they profess a limited devotion. The officials agreed that under these circumstances, they should act with the highest prudence and caution. They hoped to avoid an outbreak of violence at the same time that they aspired to gain the local residents' esteem. As La Mota explained, and I quote, taking these ornaments from their corresponding places would cause discontent among locals and would raise certain apprehension against this scholarly institution, end quote. Thus, Villalba's officials, Boyacá's intendant, and the university's president, after considering the views of the Exe Homo's devotees, decided to transfer the painting to the region's clergymen for their protection and veneration. The residents of Villalba and surrounding towns, the officials argued, would see such a decision as an act of generosity and fraternity on behalf of the university and the national and provincial governments. In 1821, many in Villaleva still associated their security and well-being with the protection and status the ex homo conferred on their community. Archetypes of the colonial past were at play in the minds of many town dwellers. The morals of stability and safety they held guided them to feel a sense of insecurity at the possibility of losing a cherished image that offered them protection and safeguard. For many local dwellers, universities and schools did not inspire the same sorts of feelings of stability and security as those the painting aroused. The national government's efforts to portray educational institutions as symbols of well-being and moral growth fell short when faced with the ex homo. Archetypes from the colonial past ended up moving people's emotions in different directions. When rumors of the painting's possible sale and transfer began to circulate, many received the news with fright, hopelessness, and rage. Protesters demonstrated feelings of despair and fear at losing their sacred image. Those who attacked the convent and seized the image displayed fury towards the authorities' alleged arbitrariness. In the end, almost all those involved, from locals who seized the painting to the officials involved in this case, sought some sort of stability and security. It was not only authorities and the university's president who asked for prudence and caution. Local residents demanded the same from their authorities. They did not want to sacrifice a sacred image that brought about well-being and protection for the community in exchange for the Republic's new and unfamiliar projects. Their notions of what stability and security meant and the emotions that revolved around them were still shaped by a series of archetypes from the colonial past. In the end, the Republican plan to establish new schools and universities ended up being relatively short-lived. Many educational institutions were forced to close towards the end of the 1820s, including the Universidad of Boyacá. In most cases, lack of financial and political support led to their extinction. There were other cases in which colonial archetypes shaped racial and social tensions and the emotions that came about from those frictions. An illustrative example is that of a Black student who suffered all sorts of acts of discrimination from school administrators in Caracas. In 1824, Jose Alvarez, a Pardo from the town of San Jose, decided to enroll his child in a school in Caracas. As happened with many schools at the time, the institution was owned and administered by the clergy. Both father and son faced innumerable obstacles as soon as they came in contact with the school's directors. At first, the principal claimed that there was no room for the student. The principal then tried to convince the student to change his mind, asking him to pray so that the Holy Spirit would enlighten him and guide him in the right direction. Seeing that such efforts were futile, the principal explained to father and son that the school's reputation would suffer from his enrollment. The principal even sent a petition to Caracas authorities, asking them to stop the Black students' enrollment. The request was apparently ignored, and Alvarez's son was finally admitted despite the principal's countless efforts to stop his entrance. The act of discrimination against the Black student not only worsened once he set foot in the school building. A printed leaflet describing the case explained that Alvarez's son immediately faced, and I quote, the affronts, the slanders, the vituperation of the Sambo, the annoyance of his classmates, the displeasure of their parents, their desire to retire their children to avoid staining them with the company of the Sambo, the slanderous accusations of committing the darkest vices. The text claimed that the students' admission saw the rise of a particular genre of vile malevolence with the only goal of exasperating the father and compelling the son to leave, end quote. The student suffered so many insults and offenses that he ended up abhorring the school. Seeing this child's distress, the Archbishop's provisor made the most of the situation and induced the Black student to write a letter describing all his suffering and requesting his own discharge. With the letter in hand, the provisor and the other school administrators accepted the student's request, and without consulting Alvarez Sr., they put an end to the child's matriculation. In this particular case, there are racial archetypes from the colonial past, the idea of castas and blood purity that were at play. This is one of the many famous paintings of castas in which they show the different casta categories on the upper left hand, the white, and then slowly going down in the social racial hierarchy to the mixture between blacks and Indians. These two are other famous paintings of famous casta paintings. They will usually portray castas, people of mixed race or blacks, in a not very positive way. Here on the left, a black woman acting violently. On the right, a black woman acting not so nice, probably being a bit annoying. But these mental images, these archetypes, were in the minds of those in Caracas who ended up discriminating against Alvarez and his son. The news of this case of discrimination reached Bogotá. It was studied in Congress, and Congress was quite inactive and did not take many concrete actions. It first reached a committee which basically just asked for prudence. They didn't want to take any serious actions. They actually said that the provisor who asked for the child's dismission was actually acting prudently, and that was something that should be praised instead of punished. They also talked about not passing any law or any decree because they considered it completely useless. They simply said that they had to be prudent, and that these sorts of acts of discrimination that were very illustrative of some of the aristocracy's sins would have to be tolerated for some years more. And in this case, there's some issues that have to do with Caracas. Caracas was probably the city with the highest population of pardos and free blacks, but it was also the city that saw the most cases of social racial mobility, but it was also the city that saw the highest levels of resistance amongst the white elites. So in Caracas, we see the conflation of all these tensions, of all these castas trying to ascend in the social hierarchy, but at the same time, the elites try to resist. There are other cases of racial dreams of racial equality and manumission that were constantly broken. Numerous barriers were obstructed the implementation of policies promoting manumission and racial equality. For instance, laws leading to the abolition of slavery were gradually reformed or derogated in favor of the economic interest of slave-owning families. Slave owners in Popayán and other regions sabotaged manumission committees and prevented many slaves from obtaining their liberty. Simón Bolívar, who in the 1810s made several speeches in favor of racial equality, by the mid-1820s was constantly waving the flag of racial war, with his numerous references to extreme violence that had taken place in the Haitian Revolution. Bolívar continually alluded to the term pardocracia to refer to a government run by pardos, knowing that it would arouse fears towards the social ascent of free blacks and to the possibility that they could hold positions of power. Bolívar's anxieties not only revolved around his fears of racial mobility and racial war, but also around the Republic's lack of political stability. Colombians from all stratus of society shared this feeling of uneasiness at the Republic's apparent fragility. Bolívar, other political leaders, and their supporters sought ways to have a stronger, more centralized national government that could face threats such as the Spanish invasion or the rise of secessionist movements within Colombian borders. Moreover, they also aspired to have a powerful president that could enforce order and security and put an end to the many intrigues that made Colombia seemingly ungovernable. Aline Helg argues that around the mid-1820s, Bolívar and his followers began to profess the idea that only by adopting a semi-monarchical constitution would Colombia be able to cure itself from the many ills typical of a young, multiracial, and mostly illiterate nation. Around 1825, Bolívar's constitutional project consisted of a federation of authoritarian republics under the supreme authority of a president for life. In his project, the lifelong president would be himself. By 1829, Bolívar openly endorsed the idea of adopting a monarchic government, with a European monarchy sitting on the throne. In a series of letters, the Council of State, the Council of Ministers, and Bolívar's secretary discussed the president's instructions regarding the possibility of transferring control of the Republic of Colombia over to a European monarchy, other than the Spanish one. By late 1821, the council's ministers and magistrates had apparently been discussing for some time the best ways to contact the English and French monarchies in order to present them a formal request. Yet, for a variety of reasons, the councils decided that it would be more appropriate to present the request to the French monarchy. For one part, the French, as Colombians, were Catholics. Likewise, members of the councils had close relations with the Duke of Montebello, who could personally present the request to the French monarch. The plan anticipated that once the French accepted the request, Bolívar would be named temporary monarch of Colombia. After his death or abdication, he would be replaced by a new monarch chosen among the French dynasty. In the 1820s, this attempt to reinstate the monarchy and European control over Northern South America was perhaps the most explicit and manifest example of the persistence of colonial and monarchic archetypes. Throughout the 1810s, Republican leaders, time after time, had to refuse royalists who claimed that republicanism would only bring about anarchy. By the late 1820s, some of these same Republicans ended up dooming independence and the Republican system, accusing them of simply bringing about chaos and many other ills. By the 1820s, so many years of violence, unrest, and political factionalism had left many feeling hopeless and fearful. Yet, in the case of many, these fears and apprehensions also grew out of the fact that their references and models of stability and security were now missing. The absence of the monarchy, a crown, and a throne fueled people's misgivings, anxieties, and fears. In that sense, the persistence of these monarchical archetypes helps explain why Bolívar and so many others believed that returning to a monarchical system would bring about the political stability and well-being they had been missing. And this is it for today. I think we can open it for questions and comments.
It was fantastic. Oh my gosh, I have so many sort of thoughts and notes of things that could be relevant. But I'd like to open it up for questions. Could we change the view there in case someone wants to participate? Like if you can stop sharing the mouse is there. Yeah, if you can stop sharing for now. If you want to, I'll try. Just the red thing. Just the red button that says stop share. There, that's it. And then we can see if anyone in the screen would like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, the hand icon in reactions, and we'll give you the word. So I'm happy to start, although unless you want to go first.
If you don't mind, I always have questions.
I mean, go ahead. I still sort of need to formulate my question, I guess, in my head.
So yeah, thanks, Juan Pablo.
Thank you.
I also read your prologue, and I read it like thinking of like what emotions do, right, and what they help us understand, and of course that created many questions. So one is that I think we have talked about it, but so what is different from customs and practices, right? So what do emotions do, or do we need to understand them in relation to custom and practices, or are they different? What do they tell us that is different from just a focus on these are the practices and people difficult? So emotions and practices we can see as these frictions in the face of change, right? They always
tend to explode more or become more visible in moments of frictions and change.
So I wondered, like, what would emotions like tell read emotions in relation to practice. If we cannot like disentangle them maybe. And that's what. And the other question is trying to or maybe finding like loopholes. So my understanding from the presentation that I did not get from the prologue was that you want to argue that well, with independence was not really such a huge deal, right? There's a lot of continuity in the new republic. So in that sense, emotions allow for that continuity to happen. I don't know if I'm interpreting that right, but I wonder if emotions can also allow for change to happen, which is particular to your first example of the throne, how the throne allows the constitution to happen in a sense, like allows people to accept the constitution. And I wonder if there are more examples such as that one, which is very different from the other examples that you did in the prologue, I think.
Yes, yes. Regarding the second question, one of the main points I want to make in my broad points for the dissertation is to emphasize a little bit some of the continuities that happen. There are big debates about independence in not only in Colombia, but in Peru, in Argentina, in Mexico. In Bolivia, this is the period that has probably been studied the most amongst Latin American historians. Many from a very political point of view, and there's a lot of traditional historians in the 19th century that try to justify independence and justify why usually the white aristocracy is now ruling these new countries, and they try to show that there was some change. Then, in the 1960s and 1970s, many scholars, usually left-wing Marxist scholars, were trying to show that there was not a lot of change, that the social class, the same people who were on the top continue to be on the top, the same people who were on the bottom continue to be on the bottom, and there was not a lot of social change. In the last years, since the 80s, 90s, there have been much more nuanced debates trying to show that it was much more complex, that the constitution still had very interesting debates and concepts that allowed for some liberty and for some freedom for some, and paved the way for some social and political change. But some of these more recent scholars have, in my opinion, tended to exaggerate some of the benefits that came from independence. So there's some who talk about the vanguard of what was happening in Colombia, Venezuela, and they quote the constitution and the manumission laws and these sorts of decrees, showing that many things were changing and to an extent were improving. And I feel like that's true, but in practice, what was happening to the lives of many people, those changes were taking place in a very, very slow way, and many did not see those changes or did not experience those changes until much later. But with emotions, I completely agree. There are moments in which emotions do promote change and incite change to happen in a faster way. There are other moments in which emotions tend to slow those changes and become, to an extent, something that completely slows and hinders change. And there are many, for this period and this region, there are many examples of both cases. For instance, something that an emotion or an event that led to change is something I study in my first chapter of this dissertation. I study in that first chapter the months leading to the formation of the Junta de Santa Fe, the 20 de Julio, Junta de Santa Fe. 20 de Julio is when we celebrate independence in Colombia. And from mid-1808 to that date, many rumors arrived or circulated around Santa Fe, Bogotá. Stories of things that were happening in France and the Iberian Peninsula, rumors that the viceroy had allied with Napoleon and was going to kill all the Santafereños to hand over power to Napoleon. So people who were actually loyal, they were Santafereños, but they were still loyal to Fernando VII. They were still loyal to the crown. They wanted to basically killed the viceroy because of his loyalty. But all these rumors and misinformation eventually led many people to question their reality or their sense of reality. In that chapter, I argued that their hegemonic frameworks were disrupted. So in that case, feelings of mistrust, fear, actually led to change because they led people to consider the possibility of creating a junta, and some years later, the possibility of using that junta to declare independence and form a republican government. So that's like one case in which emotions, to a certain way, lead to change or accelerate change. And although I still have to answer one of my questions, and the first question about emotions and practice and customs, for me, they're really related. There's an anthropologist, her name is Monique Shear, who argues that emotions should be considered practices. They should be seen as practices, particularly when it comes to studying how emotions are expressed. Since for us, it's impossible to know how a person is, not only as a historian, but also like an anthropologist doing ethnography, it's impossible to know what a person is actually feeling inside or thinking. But what we can actually see are the expressions, the manifestations of those emotions. So she argues that the best way to approach emotions is by seeing them as practices, because the way we express emotions is not only something that's individual to us, but it also responds to what society as a whole, or society in a given moment and in a given place, decides that how emotions should be expressed and felt. So today, like in Philadelphia, 2022, crying or laughing has certain implications. So when we feel an emotion and we express it in a certain way, it is a practice because we are responding to those conventions and customs of a particular given time. That would be Monique Shear's argument, and I really like her approach, and I throughout the dissertation I try to see emotions as practices.
No, actually, I should wait because I have many opportunities to discuss this with you. Let others go.
I'd love to ask 2 questions before we get deeper into emotions. I mean, I also find that part of your project just absolutely fascinating. But I'm going to ask 2 far, one much more narrow question, and possibly, clearly historical. The other one, broader, and that obviously has implications for the present. It's hard not to bring history to the present for those of us who are political scientists. So sorry about that. So first, I wanted to ask you if you could comment a little bit about the relationship between regional change and national change at the time of the transition, let's call it, from the colonial period to the new Republican period. In pages 18 and 19 of your chapter, you mentioned that the freedom of wombs law in Antioquia was from 1814, but at the national level, it was 1821. So could you comment a little bit of what goes going on, in this period that you are studying so much in depth, between these representations, emotions, or however you want to, address this issue, or whether it's just legislation, between the regional and the national level? So that's my first question. And the second question, it's far more complex, and I'm not sure I can articulate it very coherently, but I put it this way. During all the colonial period, possibly starting in the 16th century, we see, and probably this, came from sort of a long Spanish tradition in the Iberian Peninsula as well. We are seeing the colonial elites or, you know, powers, whether monarchical or clerical, trying to bring order to racial categories and mixing. And here I have sort of two little questions. One is, I heard a historian say, and this may be wrong, that at least in the early parts of European encounter, so say 16th century, Blacks were above indigenous in terms of value, you know, in terms of hierarchy, because the Spaniards were used to the Blacks through the slave trade that was already quite common in the Iberian Peninsula because of Portugal's trade. So the Blacks were seen more European, more, you know, closer to home than the indigenous in the earlier part. Now, in your presentation, as well as in the paper, you implied that no, it's an issue of gradation, you know, of what the sociologist Eduardo Teles calls pigmentocracy. So it's, you know, how much melanina you have, and you know, because the indigenous would have less than the Black, therefore they are in between. So my question is, regarding this, you know, obsession with racial categories and ordering, did the perception of what Blacks were in the hierarchy change between the 16th and the, you know, early 19th century? Okay, if you can comment on that, if you don't know, but if you know, I would be curious to know. And the second part of that question is, you know, at that time, at the time that you are studying in the early 19th century, the revolutionary thing was to eliminate racial identification from state records, right? So the breaking with the past is, let's forget the caste system, which is colonial. Let's, you know, take it out from the state records. Now, and here's where the political science question comes in. Now we see throughout Latin America activists, you know, most recently, you know, talking to a colleague in Chile, who are Afro-descendants, who are indigenous, is like, we need to put this back in the state records. We need every census that is not asking about self-identification in terms of race or ethnicity. We need to ask it, right? So how do you see that moment that you study where the revolutionary thing was to get rid of racial classification to our present day, where there is a need perhaps from people who self-identify as minorities and otherwise mestizo or you know, societies of white privilege to push the state to record again. So those are my two questions before having two parts. Thank you.
Thank you, Tulia. Regarding the first question about regional versus national, I think there are several issues we should have taken into account. At least in North and South America, I'm not sure if this the same happened in Mexico and Peru, Bolivia, and this what we now call the Southern Cone, but at least in Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, the first years after independence, or like the first years of independence, were very federalist. They were like, regions were divided by provinces. There was actually a big civil war between a federal state called the Provincias Unidas versus Cundinamarca, which was more centralist and wanted to have the control over the whole region. And the more federalist Provincias Unidas, each province had its own laws, its own decrees. They got together like basically out of security and for military reasons, and then they started expanding, and they eventually conquered Cundinamarca. But after they conquered Cundinamarca, what was known as the Reconquest, when the Spanish troops arrived, or the royalist troops arrived to take control of North and South America. So the Provincias Unidas, once they conquered Cundinamarca, was really short-lived. After we only lived for like 6 months or a year. But that's a point that's worth making, that was very federal. The first years of independence were very federalist. And then from 1815 all the way to 1820 or so were periods of about 3 or 4 years in which the royalists had once again control of most of the region, and then 2 or 3 years of a lot of war until 1820, 1821, when they have a new constitution. And what they did in 1821 was partially take bits and parts from the different constitutions, provincial constitutions, and they basically assembled them and got them together, added some new articles, and so on. So I don't know if this completely answers your question, but yeah, when there was like finally a national constitution, it was inspired by previous more provincial constitutions, and of course there were some regions that had more slave owners who opposed manumission, others who were like in a transition. Kind of Antioquia was a bit in a transition, so they were more in favor of manumission. But that's what I would have to say to that question. Regarding racial categories, your first question regarding from the 16th century to the 19th century, how racial categories evolved. My impression, I'm not an expert about this, but my impression was that indigenous people were almost always seen above blacks. But
I got so much to answer, but
That has to
but
do with 1512 debate of Las Casas. I mean, that
yes, but I'm gonna, because there's so many like different branches through which we can, and it's gonna fail. But there is something that I always think about when right after the first years of conquest or contact, many nobles of the indigenous groups ended up being kind of brokers between the indigenous plebeians and Spanish authorities. And they had in the social hierarchy kind of a middle position. They were not in the bottom, they were clearly in the middle. There were some actual mixes with Spaniards or Europeans. Some of these brokers eventually traveled to Spain. In Spain, they met the king. The king gave them gifts. I mean, they were treated as nobles, as people who were clearly not in the bottom of the social scale. Of course, this has to do with like the indigenous nobles, indigenous like plebeians, the ones who were already in the bottom of their social scale amongst indigenous, were clearly on the bottom, and there were some conquerors and some of the first colonizers who considered them to be basically not even human. And then comes all these debates with the Las Casas and new laws. The new laws of the mid 16th century do give them a certain position, which is a bit, in my opinion, a bit higher than what most black slaves have. And later on, as more blacks or Africans arrive in Spanish America, this discourse of blood purity becomes stronger. The idea that the Jewish blood was a blood stain in the Americas takes a new form, and it's the African blood becomes a stain on the blood, and it's impure blood. And that becomes stronger and stronger throughout the centuries until the 18th century, when many of these casta paintings were painted. That was the first question regarding racial categories, and with your question about like a return to racial categories, I would have to say two things. One is that even though right after independence, many of these new constitutions talked about ending castas and putting an end to all these racial categories, there were many sectors who actually fought to maintain these racial categories, especially indigenous people. For them, it was very important to still be considered Indians, partly because of the resguardo. They even asked, they said, like, we want to continue paying tribute, or not all, but many of them say, we want to continue paying tribute. This is a tax, and even if it's painful to pay, we want to continue paying tribute because this gives us access to our ancestral lands, to our resguardos. So for them, it was, they preferred to be Indians and continue being Indians rather than common universal citizens. So there was some pushback to this idea of eliminating all racial categories. And one of the tensions that still continues, and I try to mention this in this paper I presented, was that even though the laws eliminated racial categories, in the minds of most people or in their culture, racial categories still existed, and people would still fight to maintain these racial hierarchies. For someone that was white, of Spanish descent, it would be a humiliation to see a Black person that was more wealthy, better dressed, and the only way he could that person could socially and culturally demonstrate that they were superior to the Black person who was wealthy and well dressed was alluding to these social racial hierarchies and making sure that even though the laws no longer existed, that in the minds of everyone and the social customs, these ideas were still present, and I think they're still present nowadays. And I think it's precisely because they're still present nowadays that there has so many minorities want the debate to call the racial categories as they are and not simply talk about mestizos or that we're all the same, but they want to bring them up so we can actually talk about them and talk about how all those people have been actually discriminated because of their racial category.
That's great, thank you.
So thank you, Juan Pablo. Thank you for this is amazing and really interesting. But I have some comments. It's not a question exactly, but I would like to know more about what you consider race and casta to define to choose different. You said here that the government leave the casta categories but they maintain some low categories, legal categories. And what's this difference between? I don't know if I really understand what you consider with this race, casta, and color and origins. All those things is mixed in a process of racialization, but this is what I understood by you are explained. But I don't know if you put it in some place in your work.
Yes.
Yeah, but another question. I really like a window you open about the revolution in Haiti. I would like to know more about that because I think it's very impressive across Latin America. There is a book in Portuguese, I don't know if you want interested, but it's called Onda Negra, Medo Branco. It's very expressive in terms of how in terms of emotion, this revolution was important across the Latin America. And just to reinforce this, what Tulian mentioned about the color categories. In Brazil, in 1970, when the military government retired this category of the census, national census, Abdias Nascimento, a Black intellectual in Brazil, charged the government for genocide. So this is the value that it's happened in Brazil when this category was out of the registers. And if you want to know about that, I would love talking with you about that. So that's it. But the question actually is only about this connection between color, origins, race, and casta.
Yes, it's something I should have mentioned in the paper, maybe at least with a footnote, and I should have mentioned this when you asked the question. I'm not an expert on how race discourses and how race was understood during the colonial period, but it's much more complex than simply the color of skin. It's not simply pigment.
Yes, yeah.
It's much more complex because they even add notions of conduct. So in the two paintings, the casta paintings I showed, the fact that the black women were acting kind of violently.
It was before
Was-
the Darwinism. You know?
Yes. So of course, color of skin has to do factions, like physical factions and features are also important. Sometimes even last names, the way people acted, hair. There's a lot of physical and but also other cultural traits that come into play when in the colonial period, at least in Spanish American, people were trying to define race or casta. So I think it was a much more complex, even if today it's kind of difficult to define race, during the colonial period, I think it was even more complex and were even more different layers. But many different issues came into play. And the castas, at least the casta paintings, they define, at the time they defined casta simply as someone that was mixed race. So like completely whites come up in the pictures, but it's like to compare them versus the other castas. And the castas are all the other that are mixed race. And each one has names, so like if there's some indigenous blood plus some white blood plus some black, they will have a different name depending on like the degree of black blood versus white and indigenous. Like the first casta painting I showed you, they had like 16 different paintings, and each one was a different category. But in those paintings, they also try to show some conduct, the way people behaved, the way they dressed. So it was not only physical features, but also cultural ones. I'll ask you for the name of this author you just mentioned, because
Sure.
it sounds very interesting.
Well, I have three things to say a little bit for the conversation. Just about these casta things. So the castas, these casta paintings were really one category for each type of mixture. If you marry the son of a black and an Indian marries the daughter of an Indian and a white, then it would be this name. It's all the different kinds of mixtures you could get were one casta. Now, Thomas Abercrombie, an anthropologist, used to say that these paintings of castas were actually more the desire to put an order to a totally unruly mixturing of everybody with everybody, so that these castas were not really real and people would not really go by the casta, by the category. Like if you are a quarter Indian, a quarter black, and a quarter white, and a quarter Jewish or whatever, then you would be X. And if I was half Indian and half black, I would be Z. Nobody really used this, but what Thomas Abercrombie would say is that these paintings were there to kind of tell people some kind of order that actually did not exist in society. That was one thing of his.
No, I know what casta is,
Yeah.
but I don't know how Juan Pablo are handle this all of those concepts inside his job. You know, this is the question.
No, but the castas, I took it just as what was in the imaginary of people that came out at that
Because
moment, right?
I'm understanding what I'm trying to understand. His job is in the middle of the transition of two systems: the caste system and the biological system of races.
I was going to come to that point.
Yeah.
I was going to come to that point. I think I personally think it's very important to see that the concept of race has evolved from the 16th century to the 19th century hugely, right? And what we know today as the biological foundation of race the result of scientific racism of the 19th century. In the 16th century, biological, even the blood thing of the Jewish, it was blood, but it was blood. Jewish blood was Jewish soul, if you want, Jewish religion. It was not in the blood, it was all mixed. The physical, the biological, the spiritual, the whole thing. So that the concept of race in the 16th, 17th, 18th century was not at all what we know today after 19th century biological racism.
And
So
nowadays,
and nowadays
yeah.
it's even more so, but we have a lot from 19th century biological racism, scientific racism that biologized, you know,
Yes.
much more. So, but yeah, I have many things to say. One was about this, because these things of castas that were not, people didn't really buy those things every day, but they were the kind of the hegemonic representations that were in the imaginary. I don't know why I said that. It was neither here nor there, it was not a question, but no, I really like your take on emotions, because we've been trying to deal with that for some time, and the concept of coloniality that Tano brought about, which, I mean, since independence, we have been trying to deal with this thing, and the people who wrote around the late 1990s, early 2000s, although you probably know the author of this oligarchic republics, because the idea was that, I said, we went into republics, but we were all oligarchic hierarchies remained untouched. And there have been all these concepts of internal colonialism, etc. I particularly like the concept of coloniality because I think it is linked to the world system, to the fact that racialization and racism is a planetary phenomenon that was developed through European colonial expansion, and it needs to be thought in relation to the development of capitalism and the development of modernity. The three things, colonialism, development of European colonial expansion, the development of modernity, and the development of capitalism happened intertwined more or less at the same time, and they have to be understood. And that's what I take, that's what I make of the concept of Quijano coloniality. But which, as you said, are all these different ways we have been trying to think, okay, we became independent, and yet, you know, all these things continued. But I really like the fact that you were bringing emotions into the picture, because it's really a factor that I hadn't thrown into the explanation of these continuities and rates. So that's the main thing I wanted to say. I
Thank
had
you.
other things, but they went into the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a brief comment on what you were saying about Recomby's notion that this was just like a framework. More recent research has showed that there were many court cases in which these terms actually come up, the castas. Sometimes it's because the same people who were asking for rights say like, no, I'm a.
But in the court cases, they're used in cross-cutting and contradictory ways. So they exist as markers, not as this is not a normative taxonomy that functions in the
it
world.
was a fact of power, that power
Yes.
was trying to put some order in a reality that was totally missing. That was his point, right?
Yeah, I mean, the terms circulate, but they don't have the normative fixity that people imagine when they see these Casas paintings, and this is why I think that it's a total mistake to show them in your job doc, because you would distract everybody with something that is not relevant to what you're trying to argue, and I will talk to you about that later. It's not,
But it does help to see what was in the imaginary.
but it
Because in
doesn't.
this case, actually what counts is the kid in the middle. Because the kid in the middle is supposed to come out of the
Yes.
picture, right?
That's the
Yeah.
normative taxonomy, but
Yeah, but-
it's not clear that it functions that way, and I don't think that it's, well, anyway, this is a separate question about, why you would want to show that in the context of presenting your work. That's a separate question. I have the liberty of being an advisor, so I can try to, what is the purpose of this presentation? It's a separate thing, but I don't, anyway, I'll just wait.
I want to ask a couple of questions. First is around the start of your presentation. First is, this is a great topic, and it's a crowded topic in Latin American history, but you're making an excellent argument, and I think bringing emotions is really interesting. But around symbolic power and your argument about the Constitution and the throne, how would you put that in dialogue with all the historiography around iconography in this period, indigenous iconography for the independence? Because I think, you're trying to show the archetype of the colonial power being used, but at the same time they were using indigenous images to try to break up with that colonial archetypes. So a little bit about that, and the other one is about the regions, and I would like to hear you talk about a little bit about the work of Margarita Garrido and works that changes. That I don't know. I participated years ago in an exhibition by a historian, Margarita Garrido, works that changes, and I think she will try. Her argument will be against some of your arguments, and I remember I'm just going to tell a little anecdote about her presentations, because she went to Pasto, and as you know, Pasto is in the south of Colombia. It was a royalist region, and during her presentation, she was talking about Bolivar, and someone in the audience shouted he's a tyrant, and the people there are still really emotional about Bolivar and the remembrance of Bolivar. So I was thinking, how would you put that in dialogue in your presentation about emotions, because you talk about emotions, practices, and everything, but I thought that, just thinking that even 200 years after, this emotion around Bolivar was still present in Paso is really interesting. So I would like to hear you a little bit about that.
Yes. Regarding the first question, I put up this painting, which is I think from the 1810s or 1820s, and it shows Bolivar with like an indigenous woman, during the 1810s, right after the first provinces declared their independence, there were several provinces trying to highlight the indigenous past. So for example, Santa Fe, Bogotá, during the colonial period, no one called it Santa Fe, Bogotá, everyone just said Santa Fe, Santa Fe. Right after independence, they start talking about Bogotá, because it's the indigenous name. And there are some paintings in which indigenous people or symbols come up. It's something I haven't really thought about, but it would be interesting to analyze. I feel that here, this indigenous woman is not necessarily shown as an equal, or it's something that I know people have studied this painting and have said things about it, and I think it could eventually make my argument more complex, but I don't think this indigenous or Indian iconography that comes up in the 1810s and 1820s contradicts what I'm saying. I think it would show different layers. Regarding Margarita Garrido and Pasto, I also went to Pasto to do research, and everyone hates Bolivar. And in the Luzán Arango, which is the biggest library in Bogotá, when Ignacio worked there, during Margarita Garrido's administration, when Ignacio was working there, they bought a lot of documents to a family from Pasto, Diaz del Castillo. I don't know if you were involved in that purchase. And yeah, there are all sorts of documents that have to do with the independence process. When I quoted those documents talking about the institution of a monarchy in Colombia and that they were gonna contact the French, so they would send someone from the dynasty. I found those in this Serie Díaz del Castillo. And there are a couple boxes that he has that only have to do with Agualongo. Agualongo, like the main leader who fought against Bolivar in Pasto and that region. And in Pasto, Agualongo is like a hero. Agualongo died close to Popayan. He was buried in Popayan. And I think it was like in the 60s or 70s, people in Pasto made all sorts of, they pressured the national government. So they would move Agualongo's body from Popayan to Pasto. And after like years of fighting, of court cases, popular pressure, they were able to move the body from Popayan to Pasto. And this guy desde Castillo, he has boxes with the letters they sent to different courts, to the president, to Popayan's mayor, to then like different news articles talking about it, the celebrations they had once Agualongo's body reached Pasto. It's all very emotional, like very nostalgic of Pasto being like more than a symbol of royalism. It's like a symbol of being different than the rest of Colombia.
No, when I was listening to you talking about Bolivar's becoming from very wanting equality to wanting difference, it reminded me of Susan Moore's book on Hegel on Haiti. Hegel, I don't know. Bookmores, BUCK -MORSE, I think. And I thought that might be an interesting thing because precisely what one of the things that she argues in the book is that you had Hegel wanting, the enlightenment, equality, etc., until Haiti happened. And then the Haitians were asking for that equality that was being promised, and that how that changed even Hegel's points to what we know Europe. But because I think what I think is very interesting in your approach is that you are pointing to a very interesting thing that what happened, as I see it, in the 19th century. You have political scientists, but so you have this political discourse on equality and all humans we are alike, and at the same time you have scientific racism being paid by universities to do research to demonstrate that we are actually naturally not alike. So, and it's also the moment in which all the ideals that had been developed in the Enlightenment come in contradiction with what is actually happening, because the equality elites do not want that to happen. So, bringing in emotions in a time when rationality was supposed to be what was governing the ideals, because we were getting rid of religion and those things, and if we were rational, we were going to be equal and good and whatever. And you're showing how actually emotions get it. So I really like you take on that precisely at that moment, because it's the moment of these kinds of contradictions, between rationality and not really, and between let's be equal, but I am an anthropologist and I know that the anthropologists in the 19th century received a lot of money from universities to show that skulls were different size, and all those kinds of things. This is time of this contradiction. So I really find it very nice. And the other thing of the tribute thing of the indigenous people,
Yes.
because Bolivar found Bolivia Bolivia has the name of the Bolivar, and we became independent in 1825. And the first thing that Bolivar did was to cancel the tribute. But a year later, we had to restate it because it was the main income of the state. So we needed that for the reasons that you said. Indigenous people kept paying even when it was abolished, because as Tristan Platt says, he calls it a reciprocity pact. No, the reciprocity pact. Silvia Rivera calls it a truce pact. But anyhow, it's like I pay you the tribute, you leave me alone in my land, right? Kind of a thing. But there was, I don't know if in Colombia, because I know that in Colombia it was abolished in 1855 or 52, something, the indigenous tribute. In Bolivia was much later because we really depended on that income. So it's,
Yes.
yeah, so these are just little things to throw.
Yeah, no, and I have to find out the exact year in which tribute was later on
I
abolished in
think
Colombia.
it's at least Brooke Larson in her book of nation trial making, trials of nation making.
Yeah.
That's where I read that it was 1850.
No, and Marcela Echeverry has studied this, and she probably, because she talks about when it was abolished and when it was reinstituted.
Oh,
and
then it was abolished again. But I
Yes.
think it was abolished by 1850. You are the.
Echeverry.
I was gonna say something, I don't remember. We probably are out of time, but
Yeah. No.
I just had one thing, which is that I think one of the strengths is that you are able to trace a way forward that emphasizes the passions and the ways in which this is America bipolar. This is deep emotional trajectories at odds with one another. So I think it's a big mistake to attribute any kind of causality in one direction or another to emotions per se. They feel the monarchists as much as they feel anti-monarchists. So that, it can be about how it deepens and intensifies violence and not, or becomes arguments against violence, but not about which side it favors. That's a big mistake. I think it's really important to contextualize what you're doing by reference to the monarchist push in Brazil and in Mexico, as well as in Bolivar's own, because part of what has to be overturned by your argument is the way that people in the present equate independence with the push for equality, which is not at all true, right? So that when enslaved people are monarchist, or when indigenous communities are monarchist, or when the monarch says, I declare abolition, or when Haiti becomes a monarchy, these points are part of what contextualize. What you can do is demonstrate that what we inherit is civil war, not what we inherit is independence. And so to have people, because people in the present want to forget that Iturbide is a monarchist. They want to forget that Brazil is a monarchy, because they believe this 19th century idea of the nation. The whole point of this work is to demonstrate that it's not nation that is the driver of history. So I think contextual, remember, you're talking to people who don't know that Iturbide declares Mexican independence as a monarchist and that Brazil is a monarchy. But when you're talking to people who don't know these things, you have to emphasize that context. Right?
Yes. And no, it was also like a matter of time. I was running to submit this paper, so
Yeah.
there has to be either a footnote at least or an additional
But it
paragraph.
can be part of the contextualization in the dissertation.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I took your point to be emotions are important and should be brought into the picture, and that point was the street.
Thank you, Kat. We're running out of time.
I think, yeah, we are.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, somebody, it's so good to see you.
Oh,
I'm so sorry,
there
I was
was a comment
late, I was at
from
the cardiologist with cardio. He's
He's
fine, he's okay, yeah, he's okay, but we had a scare, so.
There is a comment from Radek, if you want to read it, in the Zoom. Yeah, I think it was mostly saying thank you, but there might have been more to the comment that I was able to see. So if you click on the 5 from the,
I didn't recognize you.
yeah, there, and you can scroll and see what people said.
Yes.
Oh, and by the way, let's stop the recording, please.
Oh, yes.
Up, all the way up, just stop, yeah, there.